These 3 true Halloween horror stories are based on real events. They follow a lone teenager, 2 seasoned lawmen, and a group of college friends who discovered that the most terrifying legends are the ones you live through. First, a high school student on a field trip vanishes from an open plateau, erased from existence in a single moment. Then, 2 deputies hunting a moonshiner are confronted by a local legend, only to discover the real monster was hiding behind the mask. And finally, 4 friends spending Halloween in a remote cabin find themselves under siege by an unseen force that claims the property as its own. Sometimes, the silence that follows a scream is more terrifying than the scream itself. Subscribe and turn on all notifications so you don't miss what's coming for you next. Cold came up from the ground first. It was a wet, seeping cold that seemed to rise from the boggy earth of the plateau and cling right to the skin. Mr. Samuel, the supervising teacher, was counting heads. He did it every time the group stopped. A simple habit. His lips moved without a sound, his breath puffing out in small white clouds in the October air. All around him, 44 high school students stood huddled together. Their usual noisy energy had been stolen by the deepening chill. He got to 45. He stopped, a deep line forming between his eyebrows. He counted again, faster this time, his voice a low, worried sound under the constant rush of wind through the stunted spruce trees. 45. No, 44. He looked up, his eyes finding the other chaperone, and in the silence that passed between them, a simple mistake turned into a serious problem. The group was 1 person short. Liam was gone. Hours before, the day had been simple. It was the last week of October in 1981, and the air in the Monongahela National Forest had the clean, sharp scent of pine and damp soil. 45 students were on an ecology field trip, a day meant to teach them about the wild beauty of West Virginia. It was never meant to be a lesson in how easily the wilderness can take something away. Liam, only 15, was all motion and energy. He had a habit of wandering a little ahead of everyone, always eager to get a closer look at some strange rock or twisted tree. His bright flannel shirt was a slash of color against the muted browns and grays of the autumn trail. They had been hiking for hours, moving across a high exposed plateau, a strange place of sharp, rocky outcrops and ground that could turn suddenly to cold, muddy bog. Around 3 in the afternoon, the trail widened into a vast, open space. Sarah, one of the other students, remembered seeing Liam jog ahead. He wanted to get a picture of a weird cluster of trees off to the side of the path. She heard the small mechanical click of his camera's shutter. It was a perfectly normal sound, a little noise that was supposed to capture a memory. A moment later, she looked up from tying her boot. He just wasn't there anymore. In the open air of the plateau, a person doesn't just disappear, but he did. She hadn't thought much of it then. Liam was always wandering. He'd catch up. Except this time, he didn't. The first search was just panicked shouting. Mr. Samuel and the chaperones yelled Liam's name until their throats were raw. Their voices were eaten by the wind, swallowed by the sheer size of the woods around them. It was a helpless, frustrating noise. They were on a high, wide-open trail, but just feet below the path in any direction were deep, unmarked ravines and chasms hidden by thick brush. A single wrong step was all it would take. By nightfall, what started as a school's problem became a massive operation. The U.S. Forest Service and the state police arrived, their trucks kicking up gravel on the remote access roads. Search dogs were let loose, their barks and whines echoing strangely in the quiet woods as their handlers shouted commands. The forest floor came alive with the beams of powerful headlamps, the lights dancing and crossing through the trees like lost spirits. Volunteers from nearby towns showed up, their faces grim. They formed long lines, shoulder to shoulder, to sweep the woods in methodical grids. They moved slowly, their boots sinking into the cold mud, pushing through dense thickets of rhododendron that clawed at their clothes. Then the temperature plummeted. A thick, freezing mist rolled in off the peaks, a thing the locals called a ghost fog. It wasn't normal fog. It clung to everything, heavy and wet, turning the entire landscape into a silent, suffocating tomb. It muffled sound and made it impossible to see more than 10 feet ahead. Sergeant Rourke, the lead investigator, later talked about the silence. He said with hundreds of people combing the area, with dogs and all that activity, there should have been some sound. But the fog seemed to deaden everything. All you could hear was your own breathing and the drip of water from the trees. Not a cry for help, not the snap of a twig. Nothing. Liam had vanished as if he'd been erased. The search became a desperate struggle against an environment that felt like it was actively hiding him. For days, the search continued. It grew into weeks. Helicopters were brought in, their rotors beating the cold air in a frantic, loud rhythm as they flew low over the plateau. But they saw nothing. The official search turned up not one single piece of evidence. Not his backpack, not his camera, not even a clear footprint. The complete lack of any sign became its own kind of terrible evidence. It was a chilling testament to the absolute power of the forest. The police had their official theories, of course. Maybe he stepped too close to the edge of a hidden mine shaft. Maybe he'd fallen into the freezing bog water, and hypothermia had taken him in minutes. A strange report from a hunter added a darker possibility. He'd seen an old, battered, dark-colored pickup truck idling on a logging road not far from the trail. A rumor started to spread that the truck belonged to a reclusive local woman named Darlene, who was known to be fiercely territorial. Nothing was ever proven. The police could never find the truck or the driver. It was just another dead end, another question without an answer. The news crews that had gathered at the base of the mountain packed up their cameras. The volunteers went back to their jobs. The case file on Liam's disappearance grew thicker, then gathered dust on a shelf. Eventually, the search was officially called off. The authorities promised they'd keep the case open, but everyone knew what that meant. The forest had won. Over time, Liam's story was absorbed by the region, becoming another piece of local lore, joining the tales of miners and loggers lost to the unforgiving terrain. People whispered about spirits and the strange fog, creating spooky stories to explain the unexplainable. But those stories offered no comfort. They were a cold substitute for the truth, a way to turn a family's tragedy into a local ghost story. The real horror wasn't in the woods. It was in the quiet house a few towns over where Liam's parents waited. For them, the search never ended. His mother kept his flannel shirt hanging on the back of his bedroom door for years, a bright patch of color in a room that would never be used again. His father walked the trails of that same forest every weekend until his legs grew too weak, calling his son's name into the wind, hoping for an answer that would never come. They never moved away, always staying close to the phone, holding on to the impossible hope that one day it would ring and a voice would finally tell them what happened to their boy. The mystery of the disappearance became a public story, but the pain was a private, unending silence. A wound that could never heal because there was no grave to visit, no final answer, and no peace. There was only the empty space he left behind, a space as vast and as cold as the wilderness that took him. On October 31st, 1928, Deputy Harlan Finch believed the world was a place that made sense. It was built on rules you could count on. His partner, Deputy Pharaoh, was a different story. Pharaoh sat across from him in the back of the sheriff's Ford, a bundle of nerves, staring out at the dark Ozark woods like he expected something to leap out of them. Sheriff Hayes had laid it out for them. "Boone's got his moonshine operation in Devil's Backbone Hollow," he'd grumbled. "He's pushing more whiskey than anyone. Now you listen. Folks out there tell stories about some hog caller in the woods. It's nonsense. Ghost stories to keep folks away. You go in, find that still, and you bring Boone back. Don't you worry about ghosts. You worry about guns." They were dropped off where the dirt road ended. A fog so thick it felt like wet cotton swallowed them whole, eating any sound except the damp hiss of leaves under their boots. The quiet felt heavy, like the woods were holding their breath. Soon they saw strange, twisted figures hanging from low branches, crude things made of corn husks and animal bones. It was a clear warning to turn back. They found the still tucked back in a drawer. The fire was out, but a faint warmth still rose from the ashes. They had just missed them. Then Pharaoh made a choked sound and pointed. In the soft mud near the dark opening of a mine shaft were huge footprints with 3 long toes pressed deep into the earth. Before Harlan could fully process it, a terrible grating roar tore through the woods like rusted metal on bone. The sound hit him like a physical blow, making him flinch and his blood run cold. A huge figure crashed out of the trees, screaming that awful sound. For a split second, all of Harlan's logic vanished, replaced by a pure, animal fear. His mind raced to catch up, screaming that it was a man in a costume, a cheap trick with stilts and furs. But that rational thought was drowned out by the sheer viciousness of its movement and the guttural, inhuman roar that seemed to shake the very ground. The thing wasn't just a man in a suit. It was a vision of pure malice. Terror seized him, sharp and absolute. His hand shook as he drew his pistol, firing on pure instinct. The gunshots were swallowed by the damp air. Pharaoh, already primed for terror, saw the demon from the stories. The sight simply broke him. He turned and ran. Harlan, his own heart hammering against his ribs, grabbed his partner's arm, his own frantic escape tangled up with dragging the whimpering Pharaoh with him. They crashed through the underbrush together, running from a thing that had terrified them both. The creature chased them until they splashed across a creek bed. Then the roaring stopped. The hollow was silent again. Back at the station, Pharaoh was a haunted man, but Harlan was quiet, hiding a deep unease he'd never felt before. He was spooked, and he hated it. Sheriff Hayes slammed his fist on his desk. "It was a man in a suit, you hear me? One of Boone's thugs. I won't have my deputies run out of the woods by a ghost story." He pointed a thick finger at them both. "Tomorrow, at dawn, you're going back. You'll find his costume or his stilts or whatever other tricks he used." He stared hard at Pharaoh. "And you're going to face it." The next morning, Harlan needed to go back as much as Pharaoh dreaded it. He had to prove the fear he felt was just a reaction to a clever trick. He had to put the monster back in its box. The hollow was just as menacing in the gray daylight. Every shadow seemed to move. Finally, under a rock ledge, they found it. The furs, the stilts, the megaphone. Harlan felt a wave of relief so strong his knees almost buckled. Pharaoh stared at the mundane objects, the terror on his face finally breaking. As Harlan documented the props, Pharaoh called out, "Harlan, look at this!" Half buried in the mud was a small, tarnished silver locket. Harlan took it and pried it open. Inside was a tiny, faded picture of a woman and a child. He remembered a missing persons report from a town over. The description matched. The relief he'd just felt curdled into a new, colder dread. A faint, sweet, and metallic smell of decay drifted from the dark mouth of the nearby mine shaft. This wasn't just about protecting whiskey anymore. The man they were hunting, the man in the costume, was more than just a thug. He was a killer. Their mission changed. They were hunting a man. 2 days later, they found him in a boarding house just outside the county line. A quiet, unassuming drifter named Virgil. The arrest was quiet. He didn't fight. He just smiled. During the interrogation, the full truth was laid bare. Virgil confessed Boone hired him to protect the whiskey still. The hog collar costume was his idea, a way to use local superstition. But sometimes scaring people wasn't enough. Sometimes, Virgil explained with a chilling calm, it was just easier to kill them. The job was to keep the hollow clear, and a dead man tells no tales. Then he smiled, admitting it was the part he truly enjoyed. The search of the old mines confirmed the true scale of his horror. They found what was left of 11 people. There were men who had likely stumbled too close to the still, women whose disappearances had been mysteries for years, and the remains of a child whose locket had finally brought the truth to light. As the case files were stamped closed, Harlan looked out at the quiet Ozark hills, but he no longer saw peace. He saw a landscape full of dark places, perfect for hiding secrets. Harlan knows his case is not an anomaly. The 18th Amendment fueled a black market that led to a 24% overall rise in crime nationwide, including a 12.7% surge in the U.S. homicide rate during the Prohibition era. The terror he found in Devil's Backbone Hollow was merely one hidden chapter in a national bloodbath. He now understood a chilling lesson. The real monsters don't need ghost stories to hide behind. Sometimes, all they need is a good excuse. Harper, Walsh, Klein, and Bell were huddled together on the dark cabin floor, their own ragged breathing the only sound in a terrifying new silence. Just moments before, a deep, rhythmic thumping hammered against the outside walls. Thump, thump, thump. The sound shook the very floorboards, followed by the awful splintering crack of wood as something tried to force the front door. Now all that noise was gone. But a suffocating stillness had taken its place, leaving only the chilling certainty that whatever it was still right on the other side of that heavy oak door. Walsh's voice was the first to break the quiet, and it came out as a ragged whisper. "What was that?" No one answered. What could they say? They just sat there in the dark, every muscle tight, listening for something, anything. But the world outside had gone dead. No wind, no crickets, not even the normal creaks and groans you'd expect from an old cabin. The silence itself felt wrong, like holding your breath and waiting for a blow to land. It was supposed to have been a simple weekend, a cheap getaway for Halloween for 4 West Virginia University students who were sick of their dorms in Morgantown. Klein had an old Ford Bronco that could handle any road, and Harper had found the rental online. It was a historic cabin, he'd said, tucked away in the Monongahela National Forest. He was the type to get excited about old stories of loggers and pioneers. The rest of them just wanted a place to drink a few beers and forget about midterm exams. The drive should have been a warning. The highway narrowed to a 2-lane road, then that road turned to gravel. Soon enough, the gravel disappeared, and they were on a muddy, rutted-out logging trail that was barely a road at all. The last few miles were a crawl, the Bronco bucking and lurching. Tree branches, bare and black, scraped along the sides of the truck. The sound was like long, sharp fingernails dragging across the metal. When the cabin finally came into view, it looked like it had grown right out of the dark woods. It was older and rougher than the pictures had shown. The wood of the walls was nearly black from a century of rain and snow. The front door was a beast, a thick slab of dark oak. It looked like a bear had tried to tear its way through it, not just once, but over and over again. Deep, jagged scars covered it from top to bottom. The inside wasn't any friendlier. A deep, damp smell of rotting leaves and old wood hung in the air. Klein, ever the practical one, went straight for the big stone fireplace and got a fire going to chase out the chill. But it didn't work. Not really. Harper noticed it first, a spot a few feet from the hearth that stayed cold, not just cool but freezing. You could have the fire roaring hot enough to make you sweat, but if you walked through that spot, a deep, unnatural cold would go right through you. It was a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. Walsh felt it too. She took one look at the large, curtainless window that stared out into the black woods and sat down on the other side of the room, turning her back to it. Later that night, things started to get worse. Bell, a journalism major, had brought a small cassette recorder, thinking it would be funny to tape them telling ghost stories. While playing it back for a laugh, a new sound came through the tiny speaker. It was a thin, miserable wail, like a woman crying from a great distance, a sound so full of old pain it made the hair on their arms stand up. Klein slammed the stop button. "What the hell was that?" he asked. Their drunken smiles were gone. Harper told him to rewind it and play that spot again. They all leaned in, listening intently. This time, there was nothing, just their own slurred voices, followed by a bit of static. They played it back a third time. Still nothing. The wailing sound was just gone. After an uneasy moment, Belle shrugged. "We're just drunk," she said, forcing a laugh. "We're hearing things." They wanted to believe her, so they put the recorder away and dealt out a hand of cards to forget it. They were trying to forget about it with a game of cards when a sudden crash of glass made them all jump. An old, empty bottle that had been sitting on the high mantel over the fireplace had fallen onto the stone hearth, shattering. No one had been anywhere near it. Klein let out a tense breath. "Just the house settling," he said, a little too quickly. "Old cabins make noise." It probably just vibrated off. Harper wasn't so sure. He'd noticed that bottle earlier, and it had seemed stable, set far back from the edge. But he kept quiet. It could have just fallen. Still, after that, a new tension settled over the room. They couldn't shake the feeling that the crash had been intentional, that they were being watched. The real terror began around 1 in the morning. It started with a heavy, rhythmic thumping against the outside walls. It was a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the floorboards. It sounded like something enormous was circling the cabin, methodically banging against the wood with its own body. The windows rattled with each impact. Klein, fed up and trying to be brave, grabbed a heavy flashlight and said he was going to check it out. He pulled the heavy door open and stepped onto the porch, and the sound immediately stopped. The silence rushed in. He swept the flashlight beam across the trees and the muddy ground. There was nothing. No animal, no person, no tracks, not even a broken twig, which brought them back to now. Huddled on the floor in the dark. The fire had burned down to a dull red glow. Walsh, unable to calm down, had crept back over to the far side of the room. She risked a glance toward the big, dark window, and she saw it. A figure, standing just inside the line of trees. It was a woman, deathly pale. She was dressed in faded, heavy period clothing, the kind you'd see in photos from the mid-1800s. She was completely still, watching them with empty, dark eyes. Walsh tried to scream, but no sound came out. She was locked in place. The pale woman slowly, deliberately, lifted a thin white arm and pointed. She wasn't pointing at Walsh or at the window. She was pointing directly at the scarred front door. Then she dissolved back into the night. A second later, the scratching started. A grating, scraping sound from the porch, like a heavy rock being dragged across the grain of the wood. The front door began to shudder in its frame, flexing inward as massive, non-human impacts slammed against it from the outside. The scratching turned to a frantic, deep clawing. The old wood groaned and splintered. Something wanted in. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The impacts, the clawing, the noise, all gone. All that was left was the sound of 4 people gasping for air in a silence that felt absolute. They stayed like that until the first hint of gray dawn touched the window. They didn't discuss it. They just moved, throwing their belongings into their bags, their hands shaking. Harper was the last one out of the cabin. As he stepped onto the porch, he looked at the door. The morning light revealed the network of deep, jagged symbols gouged into the wood. They weren't letters or pictures. They were raw, angry marks clawed into the oak. They didn't stop driving until they reached the forest ranger station. They stumbled in, trying to report a break-in, an attack, vandalism. They didn't even know what to call it. The old ranger behind the counter listened, his face giving away nothing. When they were done, he took the cabin key from Harper's trembling hand and dropped it in a drawer. "That cabin," he said, his voice low and tired, like he'd had this conversation before. "It's not haunted. It's owned." He looked at them, his eyes serious. Something in those woods laid a claim on that place a long time ago. Those marks on the door, they aren't a warning. They're a brand, a sign of property. You folks were just trespassing. Weeks later, back at WVU, Harper, driven by fear rather than academic curiosity, couldn't let the ranger's words rest. He found a newspaper clipping in the Intermountain Archives from the 1880s detailing the disappearance of a settler's daughter near Seneca Rocks. An accompanying illustration of a strange warding sign meant to keep dark things away was nearly identical to the scratches on the Hutchinson cabin door, only inverted. A warding sign keeps things out. An inverted one does the opposite. Harper felt a new, deeper fear settle in his bones. He had no idea what he had really seen that night. He didn't know if the pale woman was a prisoner of that place or the reason prisoners were taken. He only knew that the marks on the door weren't a brand of ownership. They were an open invitation.